God, to whom every heart is open, every desire known, and from whom no secrets are hidden, purify the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love you and worthily praise your holy name. Let's all make sign of the cross in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let's all arise for entrance hymn.
Welcome to the celebration of the Daily TV Mass. My name is Father Chris Lemieux, and I'm the Director of the Office of Vocations for the Archdiocese of Toronto. Today's Mass is sponsored by the Archdiocese. Today we begin a week of daily TV Masses for prayers for vocations. In John's Gospel, we're told that Jesus is the Good Shepherd, and that those who hear his voice follow him. To hear the shepherd's voice requires quiet and prayer. Pope St. John Paul II said, "Young people, if they can be taught how to pray, can be trusted to know what to do with God's call." This week we will pray for all those who are discerning the Good Shepherd's call. Through our collective prayers as a community, we ask our Lord to help our young people to come to understand the importance of listening for God's voice, especially when making big and important decisions in their lives. Thank you for joining us this week for the TV Masses and for prayers for vocations. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all.
And with your spirit.
Friends, as we begin our celebration of this Holy Eucharist, let us begin first by acknowledging our sins and asking for God's mercy. You were sent to heal the contrite of heart. Lord, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
You came to call sinners. Christ, have mercy.
Christ, have mercy.
You are seated at the right hand of the Father to intercede for us. Lord, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
And may Almighty God have mercy on us, forgive us our sins, and bring us to everlasting life.
Amen. Glory be to the Father, glory be to the Son, glory be to the Spirit, all glory to our God. We praise you, we bless you, we give you thanks. We praise you for your glory. We praise you, we bless you, we worship you, O Lord our God. Glory be to the Father, glory be to the Son, glory be to the Spirit, all glory to our God. Lord Jesus Christ, only Son of God, you are one with the Father. Receive our prayer. Glory be to the Father, glory be to the Son, glory be to the Spirit, all glory to our God. You alone are the Holy One. You alone are the Lord. With the Holy Spirit, in the glory of God. Glory be to the Father. Glory be to the Son. Glory be to the Spirit, all glory to our God.
Let us pray. Grant, we pray, Almighty God, that putting off our old self with all its ways, we may live as Christ did. For through the healing paschal remedies, you have conformed us to his nature, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever.
Amen. In today's first reading, we will get to know that Stephen is arrested because he performs wonders and signs among people.
First reading from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 6, verse 8 to 15. Stephen, full of grace and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. Then some of those who belonged to the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and others of those from Sicily and Asia, stood up and argued with Stephen. But they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which he spoke. Then they secretly instigated some men to say, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God." They stirred up the people as well as the elders and the scribes. Then they suddenly confronted him, seized him, and brought him before the council. They set up false witnesses who said, "This man never stops saying things against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses handed on to us." And all who sat in the council looked intently at him, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Happy are they who follow the law of the Lord. plotting against me. Your servant will meditate on your statutes. Your decrees are my delight. They are my counselors. Happy are they who follow the law of the Lord. When I told of my ways, you answered me. Teach me your statutes. Make me understand the way of your precepts, and I will meditate on your wondrous works. Happy are they who follow the law of the Lord. Put false ways far from me, and graciously teach me your law. I have chosen the way of faithfulness. I set your ordinances before me. Happy are they who follow the law of the Lord.
Let's all rise for acclamation.
Alleluia, 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 alleluia. No one lives on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
In today's Gospel reading, we will hear that Jesus asks his followers work for the food that endures for eternal life.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
After Jesus had fed the crowd from the 5 loaves, he crossed the lake by walking on the sea. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there. They also saw that Jesus had not got into the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias came near the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they themselves got into the boats and went to Capernaum, looking for Jesus. When they found Jesus on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For it is on him that God the Father has set his seal." Then they said to him, "What must we do to perform the works of God?" Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In Mark's Gospel, there's a man from the crowd who brings his demon-possessed son to Jesus, asking him to heal the boy who was dying. Jesus told the father he needed to believe and his son would be healed. The man replied, "I believe, Lord, help my unbelief." I've often reflected upon these words, prayed with these words, "I believe, Lord, help my unbelief." In fact, I whisper them when I celebrate Mass in recognition that through me, with all my weaknesses, unworthiness, insufficiencies, insecurities, the Lord our God uses me to come to his people, most especially here in his body and in his blood. I believe, Lord, help my unbelief. There's both a recognition of faith, but also that my faith can be weak. These words are important in understanding Jesus' message to his followers in today's gospel, including us. Jesus feeds the multitudes, and after they are fed, they still seek him out. It seems with less than perfect motives, but with the right intentions. Jesus calls them and us to a deeper faith and a commitment to trust, to work toward a deeper faith and for the food that endures for eternal life. Friends, we are all, every last one of us, a work in progress. We have faith, otherwise we wouldn't be watching this TV Mass. And our faith may seem at times strong enough to endure all and deal with all things, but then at other times seems so weak that we may question whether we have any faith at all. If we can proclaim to have even just a small seed of faith today, if we can keep our sight set on Jesus, this faith of ours can bring us to do great things for the Lord and for the world that we live in and for each other. And don't we need that now, most especially? This is what we celebrate this week in our daily TV Masses as we pray as a community of faith for vocations. All vocations, but especially those that nourish and strengthen the church, bringing God to his people and his people to God. And that includes the vocation of marriage. Trust in the Lord must be a part of our vocabulary as Christians. The Lord infuses trust in our hearts. It's our job to respond to that. Even if we have a little faith, or if our faith is strong, we must continue to seek to grow, and God will take it from there. How do I know? I know because I trusted God, and he gave me this life, which allows me to celebrate with you today. In the late 1990s, I barely had that seed of faith, but with a slightly open heart, I went to Alpha with a friend, and that's where I met Jesus for the first time. I struggled and stumbled, but tried to trust God a little bit, and then a little bit more over the next 2 or 3 years. He placed amazing people on my path and walked with me as I became a Catholic Christian in 2003. I followed him with my still sometimes weak faith, but committed faith, and he introduced me to even more amazing people and helped me to see how I could become a disciple for him, with my own unique and particular calling for that. God and those people helped me to become strong and courageous enough to leave my job as a bus driver in Mississauga and to give my life for that food that endures for eternal life, which I discovered 2 years later as I entered Sarah House and then the seminary here in Toronto. Friends, many years later now, and having been blessed these last 6 years to serve as vocation director for this archdiocese, I've met many men and women exploring their own calling, their own vocation. And every one of their stories is one of trust in the Lord, one of faith, one of service to God and to others, and ultimately of joyful surrender. Every one of their stories also had many other people praying for them. Sometimes we underestimate the importance of prayer, but prayer is the only thing that Jesus asked for us in regards to vocations. That we must pray to the Lord of the harvest, that he send laborers into the harvest. Tomorrow, at this TV Mass, you'll hear from one of these men who I've also been part of his journey as vocation director, when Deacon Joshua Lobo, who's a transitional deacon and soon to be a priest for the Archdiocese of Toronto, will share some of his own journey with us. We look forward tomorrow to hearing from Deacon Josh. Friends, as we live in these uncertain times, the uncertainty can be a reminder of what gives us strength and gives us courage to face each and every day. And it helps us so that we can live amid fear with peace and with joy in our hearts, that which comes from Jesus Christ. Our ability to trust him and to have faith in him is of the utmost importance. Brothers and sisters, let us be inspired in hope this week as we hear the Lord's call in and through others, and as we pray for one another. Let us importantly stay safe and out of harm's way and draw close to one another as disciples of the Lord. I believe, Lord, help my unbelief, and may God bless you. And friends, let us turn now to our loving God. We ask the Lord to be with us, to be with your church, with the Holy Father, and with the bishops and the priests and the deacons, and with all of us, especially in places where the precious gift of Holy Mass can't be offered publicly. We bring our prayers and our needs before our Lord this day, asking that he hear us. We pray as a community of believers from many different places and countries, asking for guidance in these difficult and trying times. We pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For the church, that many will hear and answer the call to work and labor for others, for the food that is eternal, we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For our Christian leaders, for Pope Francis, the bishops, priests, deacons, and lay leaders, that they may love, serve, and give themselves generously and tirelessly, as Jesus did, and follow faithfully his example, we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For all people, especially our young women and men, that they be given the strength and courage to overcome fear and obstacles, and to follow the Lord in dedicated service as religious sisters and brothers unto the holy priesthood, we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For parents and grandparents, may they receive the grace to guide their children through the trials of life, and to help them discern not only their careers, but most importantly their vocations, we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For all who are sick or suffering in any way, especially those who are critical, that they be given the strength, the endurance, and healing, if it be your will, we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
And for those who have died, for the repose of their soul, that they be joyfully welcomed into paradise and life eternal, we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
Kind and merciful Lord, we give you thanks, especially in these precarious times, for all your gifts and blessings in our life. Lord, we ask you to hear these prayers and those that remain in the silence of our own hearts. We make these prayers through Christ, our Lord.
Amen. All to Jesus I surrender, born of Mary, God's own Son. Through this Eucharistic
pray that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God the Almighty Father.
May the Lord accept the sacrifice at your hands, for the praise and glory of his name.
May our prayers rise up to you, O Lord, together with the sacrificial offerings, so that purified by your graciousness, we may be conformed to the mysteries of your mighty love. Through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit,
Lift up your hearts.
we lift them up to the Lord.
Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.
It is right and just.
It is truly right and just, our duty and our salvation, at all times to acclaim you, O Lord, but in this time above all to laud you yet more gloriously, when Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. Through him the children of light rise to eternal life, and the halls of the heavenly kingdom are thrown open to the faithful. For his death is our ransom from death, and in his rising the life of all has risen. Therefore, overcome with paschal joy, every land, every people exults in your praise. And even the heavenly powers with the angelic hosts sing together the unending hymn of your glory as they acclaim.
Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Lord, we lift up your name with a heart full of praise. Be exalted, O Lord my God. Hosanna in the highest. Holy, holy, holy is the Lamb of God. Holy, holy, holy is the Lamb of God. Lord, we lift up your name with a heart full of praise. Be exalted, O Lord my God. Holy is the Lamb of God. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus is the King of Kings. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus is the King of Kings. Lord, we lift up your name with a heart full of praise. Be exalted, O Lord my God. Jesus is the King of Kings. Holy is the Lamb of God. Hosanna in the highest.
You are indeed holy, O Lord, the fount of all holiness. Make holy, therefore, these gifts, we pray, by sending down your Spirit upon them like the dewfall, so that they may become for us the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. At the time he was betrayed and entered willingly into his passion, he took bread and, giving thanks, broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body, which will be given up for you."
My Lord, my Lord.
In a similar way, when supper was ended, he took the chalice, and once more giving thanks, he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and drink from it, for this is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant, which will be poured out for you and for many, for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in memory of me."
My Lord, my God.
The mystery of faith.
We proclaim your death, O Lord, and profess your resurrection until you come again.
Therefore, as we celebrate the memorial of his death and resurrection, we offer you, Lord, the bread of life and the chalice of salvation, giving thanks that you have held us worthy to be in your presence and minister to you. Humbly we pray that partaking of the body and blood of Christ, we may be gathered into one by the Holy Spirit. Remember, Lord, your church spread throughout the world, and bring her to the fullness of charity, together with Francis our Pope and Thomas our Bishop and all the clergy. Remember also our brothers and sisters who've fallen asleep in the hope of the resurrection, and all who've died in your mercy. Welcome them into the light of your face. Have mercy on us all, we pray, that with the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, with Blessed Joseph, her spouse, the blessed apostles and all the saints who've pleased you throughout the ages, that we may merit to be co-heirs to eternal life, and may praise and glorify you through your Son, Jesus Christ. Through him and with him and in him, O God, Almighty Father, in the unity of the Holy Spirit, all glory and honor is yours forever and ever.
Amen.
At the Savior's command and formed by divine teaching, we dare to say,
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us, Lord, from evil.
Deliver us, Lord, we pray, from every evil. Graciously grant peace in our days, that by the help of your mercy we may be always free from sin and safe from all distress, as we await the blessed hope and the coming of our Savior Jesus Christ.
For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever.
Lord Jesus Christ, who said to your apostles, "Peace I leave you, my peace I give you," look not on our sins, but on the faith of your church, and graciously grant her peace and unity in accordance with your will, who live and reign forever and ever.
Amen.
The peace of the Lord be with you always.
And with your spirit. Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world, have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world, have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world, grant us peace.
Behold the Lamb of God. Behold him who takes away the sins of the world. Blessed are those called to the supper of the Lamb.
Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof, but seize your word, and my soul shall be healed. Since we cannot receive the Holy Communion, let us remember our first Holy Communion and also our best moment when we received the body and blood of Christ. Remembering that, let us partake in the spiritual communion by saying this prayer. O Immaculate Queen of heaven and earth, Mother of God, mediator of every grace, I believe that your dearly beloved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, is truly, really, and substantially contained in the most holy sacrament. I love him above all things and long to receive him in my heart. Since now I cannot receive him sacramentally, be so good to place him spiritually in my soul and never permit me to be separated from him. Amen. the Lord of wind and flame. I will live the poor and lame. I will set the feast for them. My hand will save. Finest bread I will provide, till their hearts be satisfied. I will give my life to them who Let us say the prayer after communion of Saint Thomas. I thank you, Lord, Almighty Father, everlasting God, for having been pleased, through no merit of mine, but of your great mercy alone, to feed me a sinner and your unworthy servant with the precious body and blood of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. I pray that this Holy Communion may not be for my judgment and condemnation, but for my pardon and salvation. Let this Holy Communion be to me an armor of faith, a shield of goodwill, a cleansing of all vices, and a rooting out of all evil desires. May it increase love and patience, humility and obedience, and all virtues. May it be a firm defense against the evil designs of all my visible and invisible enemies, a perfect fighting of all the desires of soul and body. May this Holy Communion bring about a perfect union with you, the one true God, and at last enable me to reach eternal bliss. When you will call me, I pray that you bring me a sinner to the indescribable feast, where you, with your Son and the Holy Spirit, are to your saints true light, full blessedness, everlasting joy, and perfect happiness, through the same Christ our Lord. Amen. Let us say the prayer for priest of Saint Therese. O Jesus, eternal priest, keep your priests within the shelter of your sacred heart, where none may touch them. Keep unstained their anointed hands, which daily touch your sacred body. Keep unsullied their lips, daily purple with your precious blood. Keep pure and unworthy their hearts, sealed with the sublime mark of the priesthood. Let your holy love surround them and shield them from the world's contagion. Bless their labors without abundant fruit, and may their souls, to whom they minister, be their joy and consolation, here and in heaven, their beautiful and everlasting crown. Amen.
Let us pray. Almighty, ever-living God, who restore us to eternal life in the resurrection of Christ, increase in us, we pray, the fruits of this Paschal sacrament, and pour into our hearts the strength of this saving food. Through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
And the Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Go in peace, glorifying the Lord by your life.
Thanks be to God. Oh, how we love Mary to praise you, honor your name, bless you always. You are the mother of Jesus Christ and mother of humankind. Lord, we seek your guidance so that we may not work for the food that perishes, but work for the food that endures for eternal life. And Lord Jesus, give us strength, because when it comes to endurance, we have to accept the pain and suffering. Help us, Lord, that we can accept that pain happily for you, for your everlasting love, which no one has given us till now. Help us, Lord, that we may accept your call, we may accept the pain, and we may always work for you. For this we pray, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us, Lord, from evil. Amen. Hail Mary, Mother of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. We'll say the Memorare together. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession was left unaided. Inspired with this confidence, I fly to thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer me. Amen. O Queen of heaven, rejoice now. Alleluia. Rejoice, for he who married no despair. Alleluia. He is risen as he foretold. Alleluia. Pray for us to the Father. Hallelujah.
Rejoice and be glad, O Virgin Mary, Alleluia.
For the Lord has truly risen. Hallelujah.
Let us pray.
O God, you deigned to give joy to the world through the resurrection of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Grant, we beseech you, that through his mother, the Virgin Mary, we may obtain the joys of everlasting life. Through the same Christ our Lord. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Virgin Mary, pray for us. Saint Joseph, pray for us. Saint Jose Maria Escriva, pray for us. Saint Faustina, pray for us. Sign of the cross, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you, friends, for joining us in this virtual Holy Mass. Have a blessed weekend ahead. Stay safe and take precautions.